Measuring religious freedom can actually be very complicated because nobody agrees on what it means. There's a lot of different definitions of religious freedom, and it means different things to different people. That's a very involved issue, but I've been asked to talk about how you measure things. So it's actually a lot easier to measure government religion policy. Because with government religion policy, a government is either doing something or it isn't doing something, and that's very easy to measure. The simplest example is, for example, does the government in some way declare an official religion? This is the state's religion. That's usually done through a constitution, but it could be done by tradition, as is the case in the UK, where there is no official constitution. It could, in a number of countries, it's done with a concordant between the Catholic Church and the government, which is an official signed agreement making the government, or it could be a law or something else, but it's relatively easy to determine if it happens. But that's not a very good measure. I'll give you an example. As I said, the United Kingdom has an official religion. Saudi Arabia has an official religion. I don't think any reasonable person would say religion-state relations are the same in the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. So you need much more than that. The older measures that you see in the literature going back 20, 30 years would all be based on an official religion or something similar. And I always thought that was problematic. So when I started the Religion and State Project, which is the project which I use to measure all these things, I wanted to look at, well, what's involved in government religion policy, and I broke it down into 3 categories. Now, the first category is what I'm calling state support for religion. How does a state support a religion? And the current version of the religion state data set has 59 ways a government can support religion. I'm obviously not going to list them all here. I don't think I have them all memorized, but our information is available on our website. But largely speaking, you have a number of categories of way the government might pass religious theology or doctrines as state law. For example, you might be forbidden to eat or sell certain types of foods or products or alcohol. You might not be allowed to open your businesses on the Sabbath or religious holidays, things like that. Another category is entanglement between government and religious institutions, where there's government institutions that deal with religion and the religious institutions are partially government. A classic example would be, say, a department or ministry of religion, which regulates religion. That's the most common one. You could have, as you have in the case of the United Kingdom, where we're sitting now, the head of state and the head of church are the same person, at least symbolically. King Charles, previously his mother, the Queen, was both the head of state and the head of church. It's very symbolic currently, but that's still important. A very common one is funding religion. Governments fund religion all the time. We've got about 10 categories of ways governments might fund religion. They could fund private schools. They could just give money to the religious institutions. A common one is supporting the building and upkeep of places of worship. We have a category which is very popular in the social sciences called other, which is everything that doesn't fit into the other more specific categories. So that's support. We have a list of 59 of them, and you can say, is the government doing this or isn't it doing it in a given year? And you add them together, you have a measure that runs between 0 and 59, and it's a pretty good measure of how much does a government support religion. I wouldn't say one country that scores 12 and one country scores 11, well, the 12 is much higher, but if countries that are close to each other have a similar level. The second category is the regulation of the majority religion. It could also include the minority religion, but it definitely includes the majority religion. A very common one is restrictions on religion in politics, which might include a ban on religious political parties or some sort of limitation on religious political parties. It could include the government not allowing clergy or religious institutions to take stands on political issues. It could even get to the point where the government monitors sermons given by clergy in their places of worship. In some cases, the government might actually dictate what the clergy is going to be given any given Sunday. If it's a Christian country, or Friday if it's a Muslim country, the government actually distributes the sermon that the clergy is going to give in their church, mosque, synagogue, temple, whatever the case may be for the religion. You have instances where the government actually selects who the clergy will be, who might be the imam of the mosque, who might be the priest of the church, or more commonly, they'll do it for the higher level clergy, the people who run the religious organization. The government can have a lot of control in that area, and there are many, many categories. The final one, which is the one that's most relevant to, well, they're all relevant to religious freedom, but the one that's the most clearly relevant to religious freedom is restrictions on religious minorities, which in our project we define as restrictions on the religious practices or institutions of minority religions which are not placed on the majority religion. To discriminate means to treat differently. And that's, so they're not, if they're restricting places of worship, if they're doing it for everybody, that might have one motivation. If they're doing it only to minorities, that can have a very different motivation. That's also one of the most common restrictions. You very often have members of the minority religion, particularly their clergy, being arrested for religious reasons or for engaging in religious politics. Restrictions on missionaries and proselytizing is also very common. And that is the one thing a government can do that is a violation of religious freedom based on all categories or all possible definitions of religious freedom. But if we want to move back to the support variable actually gets very interesting with regard to religious freedom for two reasons. First, you have unequal support. It's very common for a government to support the majority religion, or possibly the majority religion in a few accepted religions, but other religions don't get support, which the lack of support isn't technically a restriction on religious freedom, but if you look at the work of people like Roger Finke, they argue that state support for religion, for some religions and not others, creates an uneven playing field. So if you take a very rationalist approach to religion, which sounds a little odd, but there's a whole literature on rational choice theory and religion, which has a lot of very important insights. If you are just a religious consumer, you're looking for a religion or a church or a mosque you'd like to go to, well, the government-supported one, they have money, they don't need your money, so you're more likely to go there, because if you're cheap and you don't want to pay a lot of money to go to be part of your religious experience. Because the fact is, religion is not free. Somebody's got to pay for the building, somebody's got to pay the clergy's salary, somebody's got to pay for the heating, the janitor that cleans the place. These things all cost money. It's not free. And if the government's paying it, you get to go and you go to your services, whatever day of the week that might be for your religion, and you go for free. You go to this not government-supported one, the members have to support it, and that costs money. However, might be through donations, might be through membership fees, might be through bake sales, but whatever, it's going to cost more money and time. And so that will draw more people to the supported religion, which has the same effect as discrimination. So under that theory of religious freedom, state support for religion can be detrimental to minorities. But if you look at it from another perspective, a very common tactic, especially in authoritarian governments, but not just authoritarian governments, for controlling religion is to support religion, but that support comes with strings attached, where the government uses the support as a means to control the religious institutions. And that's not just something that's very common in autocracies, but if you look at democracies, that happens too. Take, for example, the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. I don't think I missed any. If I did, I apologize to the members of that Nordic country I missed. All of them, at one point in time for their state churches, Norway and Sweden no longer have state churches, but at the times when they did, all of them used the government influence over the church and the fact that the government funded the church and influenced who the clergy were to force them to change their theology on major issues like gay marriage and whether women can be priests, which are significant theological issues. And the fact that the government was supporting the religion gave them the leverage to change theology. Many religious believers are very unhappy with that and would consider that a restriction on religious freedom. So support is influential in religious freedom, and support is easily measured because the government's either supporting or not supporting. What's not so easy to measure is what's the motivation and how is it leveraged for the government to do things that might violate religious freedom. So all of these things can be measured because at the end of the day we have lists. As I said in support, there's about 59 types we're measuring. For regulation, it's 52, and for the current version, discrimination, we have 59, and all these things can be measured. The governments are doing them or they're not doing them. It's very easy to check to see whether they're doing them, and these things can be measured. We can make scales. We can focus on the influence of very specific items, like Nilay Saya has done some very good work on the influence of blasphemy laws on terrorist activity. So you can focus on any one of them, you can focus on all, and you can look at how do they influence very important factors. So all of these things are easily measurable. I've done a lot of work on the causes of religious discrimination, and they're very complex. And some of the causes are in the state support for religion category. One of the most interesting relationships between state support for religion and discrimination is that government that support religion more are more likely to discriminate. But what gets really interesting is the governments that support religion the most come in two categories. Obviously, those countries that are most closely associated with a religion. The more you're associated with a religious theology, well, the more likely you are to dislike people who disagree with your theology, and that would lead to discrimination. That's a very obvious cause. But you actually have some of the most anti-religious governments in the world are actually supporting religion. As I discussed earlier, one of the reasons governments support religion is to control it, and that's a very common tactic in anti-religious governments. Take China, for example. China is a communist country. Communist ideology does not care for religion. How much are Chinese really communist is a discussion for somebody who's more of an expert on that, but I think we can all agree they have a very secular anti-religious ideology. For a long time, they tried to completely repress religion. Sometime during the 80s, they realized that wasn't working, and they came up with a new policy, which is basically to set up religious associations. They have several religious associations, one for Catholicism, one for Protestantism, one for Islam, one for Buddhism, and I think there's one for Taoism or Chinese religions, something like that. I'd have to look it up. I don't have the full thing memorized. And basically, religious expression is perfectly okay within the context of those organizations that they control and they fund and they appoint the high-level clergy and make sure that those clergy are not engaging in anything that the government doesn't want them doing. So they're technically supporting religion very nicely, but they're keeping it in a bottle that they can look at and it looks very pretty, and they're completely under control. And those countries also discriminate against religious minorities. And you would ask why? Why would they discriminate against religious minorities? Because they hate all religions. They don't really care which religion it is. Why would they discriminate more against religious minorities? Well, one of the things that happens is ideology, whether it's secular or religious, is not the only cause of discrimination. There's a dislike of foreign religions is a common one, and we'll work with that. So let's just say you're a government, there's some foreign religion coming in, sending in missionaries, and you don't really like that because they're foreigners, it's a foreign influence. You don't care about the theology. You don't care that, say, for example, the Mormons are coming in and poaching from the Christians. If you're China, why would you care about that? What you do care about is the Mormons seem like a Western influence that you don't want in the country, so you're going to want to limit them. And the fact that you're an anti-religious country is going to exacerbate the dislike you have of the Mormons because they're both foreign and they're religious, and you don't like either, so you have sort of a multiplication effect. So yeah, that's one of the reasons you have religious discrimination in countries that dislike religion, because again, you would normally expect them to repress all religions equally. That's not what happens. So these things get very complex. Well, I've actually done a little bit of research that's relevant to this. I've been doing a lot of work lately using the rational choice approach to religion, and this branch goes back to Anthony Gill's 2008 book, The Political Origins of Religious Liberty, where he argues that governments grant either religious liberty or support a state religion based on what's in the interest of politicians. So politicians are, according to this view, are very rational actors who are looking what are the costs and benefits for any given policy. And if I'm supporting a religion, let's just say I'm the Prime Minister of England, the President of the United States, doesn't matter what country, why would I support a religion? Well, there are a number of benefits for supporting a religion, and when you support a religion, this will usually involve repressing religious minorities. Well, I get legitimacy. That's the big one Anthony Gill talks about. Things get more legitimate. Everybody likes religion, you support religion, religion is legitimate. So if I support religion, the religion supports me, and legitimacy, according to every political scientist, is necessary for governments to rule. This is basic theory that goes back to Robert Dahl, one of the most important political scientists of the 20th century. So if you take that branch of thought and maybe move it forward, you go, well, what would motivate a politician to engage in religious freedom? Well, significant international sanctions would probably work, but that doesn't actually happen. You have countries that have explicit policies to support religious freedom, such as the United States with the International Religious Freedom Act, but pretty much every study that's looked at that shows the US government at most pays lip service to that. They don't actually sanction countries for engaging in practices that violate religious freedom. They write lovely reports that discuss how countries violate religious freedom, and those are incredibly good sources for information when you're looking to determine what governments are doing. I would never rely on one source to collect my data, but that's certainly a good source among many other sources, but nothing much happens besides that. So if you could get major governments to engage in sanctions, that would work. Governments agreeing to be part of collective agreements where there's some overarching authority that protects religious freedom, such as the EU has with the European Court of Human Rights, would be good. But that works to some extent, but there are a number of countries that have had rulings against them that have completely ignored it. And there's a number of studies that actually show the courts are more likely to support religious freedom lawsuits if you're Christian as opposed to if you're not Christian. You also have that issue in the United States. So the court system seems to have the same biases that society and the judges from that society happen to have. I've also done some interesting research in the European Journal, I think it's the European Journal of Political Science or the European Political Science Review, it's European something, where we found that discrimination against religious minorities can actually be quite popular. Discrimination in countries where the population has more negative views towards religious minorities, religious discrimination goes up. And as religious discrimination goes up, a government's legitimacy goes up. This research is specific to Christian majority countries. There's some data and technical reasons why we couldn't test it outside of the Christian world. I'd very much like to, just the data isn't there to test it properly. So motivations of politicians, there's theoretical reasons to believe that it's important, and there's empirical reasons to believe it's important. So you have to figure out some way to convince politicians that it's in their interest to provide religious freedom, and that will probably work. I'm not entirely sure if there's a workable mechanism to make that happen unless governments in their foreign policy are willing to make significant commitments to leverage their foreign policy in order to further religious freedom, and all empirical evidence shows that governments, at least currently, are not willing to prioritize religious freedom over other more materialistic and power politics factors. Is religious freedom more common in democracies? The simple answer is yes. The more complicated answer is not quite. I'll get into that. If you just take a global view and you run all the variables we run, and you include a democracy variable, whether you take it, there are different democracy variables you can use from different data sets, but they all give basically the same results. Yes, there is a positive correlation between religious freedom and democracy. Democracies say, for example, discriminate against religious minorities less. That's the simple answer. The more complicated answer is the democracy factor is one factor among many that influences, say, we'll look at religious discrimination because that's the easiest measure I could use for religious freedom. It's not all of religious freedom, but certainly an element of it. For example, state support for how much a democracy supports religion, or any government supports religion, is much more influential than democracy. Economic development actually influences discrimination a lot more than people would think. And it's very interesting that more economically developed countries discriminate more. So Western countries, which are far more developed based on this factor, would discriminate more than, say, a democracy in the developing world. And I'll get to and the results actually bear that out very strongly. If you look at, say, Western democracies, which would be the classic example of the developed democratic world, and you compare that to, say, democracies in Africa and Latin America, the discrimination in Western democracies is much higher than it is if you look at the developing world. And the developed world is by definition more economically successful than the developing world. That's sort of a tautology, but that's fine. The tautology works in this instance. Another difference between the developing world and the Western world is the Western world is much more likely to support religion than the non-developing world. And the reasons are connected, because supporting religion takes resources. Discriminating against religious minorities takes resources. A government wants to discriminate against religious minorities, that's not free. They actually have to work at it. It costs money. You want to arrest them? Well, you need police, you need jails, you need judges, you need all the institutions of repression are not free. And the fact is, wealthier countries can afford them better than non-wealthy countries. It's really that simple. Discrimination and repression is luxury. People don't normally look at it that way, but in that sense it is. And in the developing world, you have less support for religion because that's also a luxury. You have less money to finance, you have less money to enforce religious laws. You have all of those things going on. And the third thing you have going on in the Western world is secular ideologies. Now that brings us over to the question of, well, does secularism increase religious freedom? Not necessarily. It depends what kind of secularism you're talking about. If you're talking about a US-style secularism, which argues the best thing for government is for government to stay out of religion, and religion to stay out of government, separation of church and state, everybody's happier that way, well, that view works. But there are many other interpretations of secularism that you find in the West, including the US. If you're looking at government religion policy, you have a neutralist policy, which is far more common in Europe than the US-style policy. And the neutralist policy is like, no, the government can support religion, the government can restrict religion, it just has to do it to all of them equally. Never turns out to be actually equal, but at least the theory is equal, the practice is very rarely equal. But suddenly the government's a lot more involved in religion, and the more governments get involved in religion, the more likely you're going to have interference of religious freedom, because, as we discussed, support can influence it, regulating it can influence it, and obviously when these things go up, discrimination tends to go up. Then you have the French laïcité policy, laïcité policy, where they believe that The way to maintain secularism is we want all public spaces to be secular, and religion remains in private. So they very much enforce. They don't want religion to be aggressively brought into the public sphere. So if you're, I remember this happened a number of years ago. I'm from a religious university, and a professor from my university, I forget which was one, was appearing on a French news show, and he wore his yarmulke. And one of the people there goes, "How dare you bring that religious symbol into our secular space?" Now, in the US context, it would be, yeah, sure, he wears a yarmulke. That's his business. What's it my business? In France, that is unacceptable, at least to people who strongly believe in the laissez-faire policy. And that version of secularism can restrict religious freedom in that manner. Now, secular ideologies have grown up all over the world, and there is no one secular ideology. To say there's a secular ideology that's unified would be like saying there's one unified religion that all religious people believe in. It's a completely ridiculous concept. But there are a lot of influential secular ideologies that are prevalent in Europe, many of them based around human rights, which is one of the most central ideologies that might have religious origins, but have developed into very secular ideologies that people believe in fervently, to the extent that people feel anybody who violates these should be stopped. And I'll give you 3 examples of prominent secular ideologies that have led to things I would classify as discrimination against religious minorities. The first one is restrictions on religious head coverings and modest dressed by women. Now, this is based around a belief in women's rights. And neutrally speaking, I'm all in favor of women's rights, but you can interpret women's rights as saying, well, any woman who's forced to cover her hair or dress modestly is being repressed. Therefore, we are not going to allow women to do this. And if you're a religious Muslim or a religious Jewish woman who is married, you're going to want to cover your hair and you're going to want to dress modestly. I mean, and it's very similar. For example, Jewish women and Muslim women who are religious actually go to the same stores to buy the same modest bathing suits. They basically wear the same modest bathing suits. It suits both religions. So this is really an issue of modesty rather than fashion. But classically speaking, a number of French beaches have banned what they call the burkini. And that's a restriction on women who may very freely wish to express their religion by dressing modestly because they consider that a religious value. So that's the first one. The second one is ritual slaughter of meat, which is also common to Muslims and Jews. The details are different across Muslims and Jews, and it's a little easier for the Muslims to get around the restrictions that are placed on that. But the restrictions are based on concepts of animals' rights and humane treatment of animals. And the argument is the ritual slaughter of animals is inhumane. You must use the stunning process that modern countries tend to require. In fact, almost all Western countries require it. The vast majority of them allow a religious exception for kosher and halal slaughter, but a growing number of countries are restricting it. The most recent one was Belgium, and their law actually made it to the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled, I thought this was very interesting, a bunch of Christian and secular judges ruled that Jewish and Muslim law is perfectly compatible with stunning during ritual slaughter, and the rabbis and imams don't know what they're talking about for Jewish and Muslim law. The technical academic term for that is chutzpah. That's one of that was, if they wanted to argue that they're basically arguing that their beliefs in animal rights should supersede, or humane treatment of animals should supersede this religious law. And that's things courts do all the time. I'm not a lawyer, but courts all the time will have to take conflicting concepts and values and decide, well, which one is going to be the one that's going to decide when they conflict. I thought it was a little egotistical of them to say that they know religious law better than the scholars, the religious scholars who are expert in that law. But that would be a second example. The third one is male infant circumcision, which has not yet been banned anywhere, although they did make an attempt in San Francisco, and it took all of a week or two for the courts to strike that down in the US, but they did pass the law in San Francisco. Of course, San Francisco. But There are a number of countries, mostly Nordic countries, which are heavily regulating it in a manner where it basically has to be performed in a clinic with doctors and anesthesiologists present, which certainly undermines the ceremony that's supposed to be more spiritual. It certainly undermines the spirituality of the ceremony. And there have been a number of attempts in some of these countries to pass laws banning it. They have not been successful yet, but it's possible they will be in the future. And the argument here is actually expressed by a German judge who banned circumcision temporarily in Germany until it was overruled by the German legislature. The argument was the infant's right to bodily integrity outweighs the parent's rights to perform the religious ritual. When the child's 18, they can decide if they want one. So these are all instances where secular ideologies were determined to have priority over religious beliefs and practices. So it depends what you mean by secular. If you mean secular, just sort of government and religion each stay out of each other's way, that works great. If you're talking about secularism as an ideology that has certain tenets that are almost religious that have to be followed, and when religion is in contradiction with those tenets, religion must change, well, that's not so good for religious freedom.